when you're up against the wall and you cannot fall. So go off, go off, go off, go off. So go off, 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 go off. So go off, go off, go off, go off.
Imagine you're a young girl and you ask your mother to tell you a bedtime story about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But instead of hearing about a vain and evil queen who tries to kill her stepdaughter after a magic mirror reveals to her that Snow White, and not the queen, is actually the fairest of them all, you instead get told a poorly constructed tale about a society in which an ignorant widower king has to be schooled by his body-positive daughter about how internalised misogyny has led to a culture of body-shaming between women, even royal princesses, and their misunderstood stepmothers. Or perhaps you're a young boy who asks his father to tell him a story about Luke Skywalker and the defeat of the evil galactic empire. But instead of hearing about a young orphan who grew up on a space farm before being forced into a cosmic battle between the forces of darkness and light, which results in his father renouncing evil and sacrificing himself to save his son from a diabolical space wizard known as the Emperor, you instead get told a bland story about a young lady named Lucy Skywalker and the sexual identity politics and economic class oppressions which have prevented they-them from finding work outside the space slave factories which are controlled by the rich and racist patriarchal elites. And on top of that, every few minutes, he interrupts the actual storytelling by jumping up and down and shouting things like, "Impressive explosion! Impressive explosion!" or "This is the most amazing spaceship you've ever seen." Now, initially you might be tempted to think that maybe your mum or dad don't actually know the story of Snow White or Star Wars, and that's why they're spewing out these fraudulent imitations of the formerly great and timeless tales. But then you remember that it was actually they who told you the original versions of these stories years earlier, and they definitely didn't sound or feel anything like these new ones do. Sure, the same sorts of things are all there from before, but now they've been changed in a way that makes them seem sterile and lacking in all of the magic that made their former tellings so special and captivating. To make matters worse, when you share your unease with your parents about these new versions of the story, they turn on you, and at the next family gathering, they accuse you in front of everyone of being an agent of a toxic, racist, homophobic, and sexist group of bedtime story lovers who don't understand that these stories aren't meant for them anyway. And if this was happening on a regular basis, it's pretty safe to say that you'd probably stop asking your parents to tell you bedtime stories, and you definitely wouldn't bother to listen any time they tried to offer one up in the future. Now, obviously, I'm not actually talking about parents and bedtime stories, am I? I'm using a metaphor to describe the current state of many film and television shows. In this brave new world, storytelling has been corrupted, but not by the usual villains. Sure, the studio bean counters still make their presence known, stifling creativity with their constant demands for stories to be reduced to mere consumer products that are assembled on a factory line and loaded with various focus group tested gimmicks in order to lure potential buyers into forking over their cold hard cash at the box office. And of course there are the deficient artisans, the over-bloated egos, and the one-hit wonders who aren't nearly as talented at making and appearing in visual stories as they might imagine themselves to be. But there's also a much deeper and more pernicious rot at play in all of this. one which presents itself as altruism, but in reality is a subversive and diabolical hijacking of mythology in order to turn it into ideological propaganda for social engineering and control. In 1905, Keith Gilbert Chesterton wrote the following: "A good novel tells us the truth about its hero, but a bad novel tells us the truth about its author." The same is true for film and television. So what exactly is the modern dysfunction telling us about the purveyors of these maladjusted mythologies? Well, in a nutshell, ideology doesn't now simply just infest the stories that are being told, it has actually corrupted the very art of storytelling itself. You see, ideology doesn't start with reality. It begins with an idea and then tries to make reality fit the idea. And for the ideologue, nothing stands in the way of this totalizing project of making the human experience submit to the all-encompassing idea which motivates their belief and action in the world. The fact that reality cannot be made to conform to ideas imposed upon it is of no consequence. The illusion of reality conforming to ideas must be upheld in order for control to be maintained. But one clear way in which reality keeps reasserting itself over ideology is through mythology. Authentic myths always break the veil of ideology because even in their inadequacies, they both grasp at and bring forth timeless truths into the world. Here's how John Ronald Reuel Tolkien once put it: "Legends and myths are largely made of truth and indeed present aspects of it that can only be received in this mode. And long ago, certain truths and modes of this kind were discovered and must always reappear." I can't help but hear a reflection of Tolkien's philosophy on storytelling in the following speech that he wrote into the mouth of Samwise Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings. "Yes, that's so," said Sam, "and we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started, but I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo, adventures as I used to call them. I used to think that they were the things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, a kind of sport, as you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered or the ones that stay in the mind. Folks seem to have been just landed in them usually. Their paths were laid that way, as you put it. But I expect they had lots of chances, like us, of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know, because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you. At least not to what folk inside a story and not outside it call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same, like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of a tale we've fallen into." "I wonder," said Frodo. "But I don't know, and that's the way of a real tale. Take any one that you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of a tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know, and you don't want them to." Here's how G.K. Chesterton put it: "Fairy tales do not tell children the dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children the dragons can be killed." So how have we now come to find ourselves in a desolate wasteland of hollowed-out mythology corrupted for the sake of ideological propaganda and control? A desert where dragons are now the heroes and those who slay them are the evil manifestations of a dark and superstitious past we must shed with frenzied rage. Put simply, we have culturally abandoned the big story of reality, and so our little stories no longer reflect anything beyond the small-minded concerns of a world constrained by materialism, naturalism, empiricism, and the loss of a sacred transcendent vision of the human person, of meaning, and of purpose. We have crowned Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche our new Messiah, and we appointed ourselves the new gods who will despise the timeless and true God while vainly attempting to recreate ourselves in our own image instead. The problem is that we will never be capable of such a feat, and so this project was always doomed to failure. Or more truthfully, because this project was so successful in its allure, it has now doomed us to failure. And when Karl Marx declared that religion is the opiate of the masses, he made everything political. For if the most important and sacred of relationships a person can ever have, that between them and God, is a political tool that keeps humanity in a state of subdued compliance with and under the control of their oppressors, then everything else, which is far less important, must also be political as well. So while Nietzsche doomed us to a Sisyphean existence of existential crisis, Marx doomed us to a world where grasping at power through political rebellion would be the only way of understanding and being present in the world. Eventually, no sphere of the human experience would be spared from this all-consuming ideological bonfire of the vanities, which is why it was only a matter of time before movies became the tools of the revolutionary firebrands and social engineers. In fact, the neo-Marxists who came after Karl Marx and were the founding fathers of what would come to be known as cultural Marxism saw mass media as the new opiate of the masses. But this very object of their disdain was also the very object of their desire, because they understood that mass media would be a powerful propagandistic weapon in their efforts to build the brave new world. They understood that words, stories, and symbols really matter, because they are the true tools of world building. Here's how Antonio Gramsci, the Italian politician who was one of the first neo-Marxists, expressed things in an essay titled Audacity and Faith that he penned in 1916. Socialism is precisely the religion that must kill Christianity. Religion in the sense that it too is a faith, that it has its mystics and practitioners. Religion because it replaced the transcendent God of the Catholics in our consciences with the trust in man and his best efforts as the only spiritual reality. Our gospel is a modern philosophy, one that dispenses with the hypothesis of God and the vision of the universe, one that lays its foundations only in history, a history in which we are the creatures of the past and the creators of the future. By the mid to late 1900s, this ideological and existential cancer had well and truly metastasized with the birth of postmodernism, a movement that completely rejected meta-narratives, the big stories that explain the world as it is, as well as treating language itself with an irrational skepticism and foisting the logically self-refuting three-headed hydra of metaphysical, epistemological, and moral relativism upon the Western world. None of the elites who were espousing this madness seemed to be too bothered by the fact that they were at one and the same time declaring their absolute certainty that there are no absolute certainties. As Pope Benedict XVI warned during the 2005 papal conclave that would eventually elect him as the new pope to succeed the recently deceased John Paul II, we are moving toward a dictatorship of relativism, which does not recognise anything as for certain and which has as its highest goal one's own ego and one's own desires. It was always naive to think that this religious vision of reality, and don't doubt for one second that this is exactly what this ideological cacophony represents, was not going to have disastrous effects on our ability to make myths. The big religious story that we embrace always informs the little stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and the world we inhabit. The loss of the communal and the relational in favour of self-creationism and an obsession with power and identity in our cinematic and small-screen storytelling is a direct result of this. Unlike the religious dogmas of Marx and Nietzsche, the formerly held Christian vision of reality is not about power. Instead, it is inherently relational. At the very centre of the Christian vision of reality is a God who is three divine persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, engaged in an eternal act of self-giving love. And in that same Christian vision of reality, every single human being is a spark of that divine relationship imprinted with the Imago Dei, the image of God, which gives every human person their inalienable human dignity and worth. This relational vision also calls to every human person, inviting them to love God, then neighbour, and then lastly, to be in a type of relationship with the created world as faithful stewards of the earth and all of its creatures and resources. In this vision, politics is part of the mix, but it is not the central focus, merely one form of relationship that can occur between groups of people. Power is not the fundamental locus of the Christian vision of reality. Love is. And this is no mere sentimentality or the forgery of lust that is often falsely equated with love in our now religiously confused world. No, this is the self-sacrificial love which seeks the good of the other without expectation of return. This is the love of a God who is love itself and who becomes one of us and then, motivated by absolute love, abandons himself to a cruel victimization and death for the sake of humanity's salvation. This Christian vision of reality is also built on natural law, the idea that the same essential human nature exists in all human beings, and that this human nature has natural ends, or goals, you might say, what the Greeks would call telos. And therefore this natural law is an objective and reliable standard for judging the worthiness and morality of various acts. In this moral vision, actions are good if they respect our essential and shared human nature and help it to flourish in its natural ends and needs, while they are evil if they disrespect, pervert, or harm such things. Let me give you 3 concrete examples of objectively good and real needs of every human person to explain the point. Peace, family, and life. No human person can flourish without peace, whether that be at a personal level, a familial one, or at a national and societal level. No human person can even exist, let alone flourish, without family, and the more stable and loving that family is, the greater the human flourishing the various members will experience. And no human person can even begin to flourish if their most important right, their right to life, the one on which every other human right depends for its existence and exercise, has not been respected and upheld by others. When considering these 3 important human goods in the light of natural law, we can then easily understand why war, which is the destroyer of peace, and adultery, which undermines and destroys the family, and murder, which ends the very life of an innocent person, are all actions which are evil by nature because they disrespect, pervert, or harm the human person and their objectively good and real needs. These great truths, the patrimony of the Christian vision of reality, used to lie at the very heart of our cinematic and silver screen mythologies. But that was then, and this is now. With the loss of the Christian vision of reality, our visual stories are now largely hollow and vacuous shells of something formerly great. Ideological sock puppets, if you will, and mouthpieces for indoctrination and for the propagandistic shaming of those who are to be othered as the heretics, the enemies of the new religious order. The primary focus is not about the relational nature of the human experience, our common brotherhood and sisterhood that is preeminent and prior to political identities, or the need for healing, where we might have lost sight of the Imago Dei in others and treated them with injustice. Now it's about revenge and ridicule. It's about using power to try and tear apart the very fabric of reality in order to erect false idols in its place. Idols which demand unbending acquiescence, without which the only prospect for dissenters is anathema and damnation. And I really can't understate how pivotal natural law is to compelling and authentic mythology. But in this new mythological landscape, there is no essential human nature or objective human goods to be strived for and protected. There is just cold, hard empiricism, power, desire, and self-gratification. As long as the characters are consenting, evil can be called good, and good can be called evil. And there are no higher and universal human goods which are part of a shared human experience. There is now just ever-fracturing lived realities based on identities of victimhood and oppression. Even history itself is now meaningless, a blank slate that can be utilised for any ideological end, regardless of what is actually true or false about the real events that it claims to depict. Most perversely of all, and in true propagandistic fashion, blatant falsifications of history are now regularly presented as true retellings to the unsuspecting masses. Even the very artisanship of storytelling and acting and the craft of cinematic filmmaking is now less important than the proclamation of ideological dogmas. As long as the propaganda is issuing forth into the world, nothing else really matters that much. This is basically the big-budget studio version of the cringe-inducing youth group dramas of the 80s and 90s, except now the people producing these things are holding glitzy awards ceremonies each year to pat themselves on the back and celebrate their mediocrity. Obviously, there are notable exceptions to all of this, but they only serve to prove the rule, and they are becoming rarer by the day, unfortunately. And there is an obvious reason why the new religious ideologues have targeted the formerly great stories for their propagandistic corruption. You see, they are incapable of producing their own things of beauty, their own meaningful mythology. So they have to take over the bodies of the formerly great stories and inhabit and manipulate them like a demonic entity does with any human host it possesses. Ideology is incapable of creation and attraction. Its craft is that of imitation, manipulation, and domination. It has to seduce or compel loyalty by force because it lacks the beauty to attract it voluntarily from viewers. The other reason they target the great stories of years gone by is precisely because those stories contain the beacons of the Christian vision of reality which they so despise. These former testaments to a tradition of goodness, truth, and beauty must be torn down and replaced with the false and tacky trinkets of the new paganism. When you add in the corrupting effect of consumerism and art as a sellable commodity, the whole thing just collapses into irredeemable chaos. Visual stories are built of words and images, and as such they are symbolic manifestations of deeper truths and of a religious vision. But if you don't have a deeper truth, or your religious vision is false, or you've rejected truth altogether, don't be surprised to discover that your mythology is just plain awful with no compelling and lasting attraction, just mere and short-lived manipulation of the masses through advertising campaigns which may seduce them into the theatre, but won't give them anything meaningful or profoundly good, true and beautiful to take away with them when they leave again. And the answer to this crisis will not be found in a studio boardroom. It can only be found in a church or in the pages of the Christian scriptures and the great theological, spiritual and philosophical works of that same tradition. And that vision of reality, goodness, truth and beauty aren't merely attributes of God. God is goodness, God is truth, God is beauty. Meaning that any encounter we experience with any of these three transcendentals is a profoundly mysterious and tangible encounter with God himself. Which leaves me wondering exactly who or what are we encountering now in the current and corrupted mythologies of our age. I'll leave the concluding word to J.R.R. Tolkien. We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God. Indeed, only by myth-making, only by becoming sub-creator and inventing stories, can man aspire to the state of perfection he knew before the fall. Our myths may be misguided, but they steer, however shakily, towards the true harbour, while materialistic progress leads only to a yawning abyss and the iron crown of the power of evil. Thank you for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up and share it with others. That really, really helps. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and help us to grow this humble channel. If you want to support our work, you can do that with any amount at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. And if you become a $5 or more monthly patron, you'll also get access to our daily patrons-only audio podcast from Monday to Friday as well. And a huge thank you to all of our patrons. It's because of you that this and all of our other content is made possible. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, live by goodness, truth and beauty, not by lies. And I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.